My patron said play Cursed Mountain. Why should I play Cursed Mountain? My patron said play Cursed Mountain. Why should I play Cursed Mountain? My patron said play Cursed Mountain. Why should I play Cursed Mountain? My patron said play Cursed Mountain. Why should I play Cursed Mountain? What's more annoying than trying to give the backstory to a game from a developer that you forgot existed? Well, how about giving the backstory to a game from 2 developers that you forgot existed? Before I get into the particulars of this mountain-based survival horror game, I'm going to throw 2 studio names at you and ask which one you think survived longer, Deep Silver Vienna or Sproing Interactive. Before I tell you the answer, a bit of background. Deep Silver Vienna started life as Games That Matter, which was co-founded by 2 former Rockstar Vienna managing directors in 2007, shortly after Rockstar Vienna was shut down by Take-Two. Yeah, Take-Two making shitty cost-cutting moves is not anything new for them. Only a few months after being founded, Koch Media acquired Games That Matter and put them under the umbrella of Deep Silver, who you might know now as that publisher that helped kill the Saints Row franchise. Meanwhile, Sproing Interactive was founded in 2001, getting its start with games like the PS2 version of Morhun X, or working on sound for Neighbors from Hell. German-speaking viewers, I'm sorry if I butchered the pronunciation of Morhun. They'd continue working primarily on PC games and the occasional console port up until about 2007, when they started consistently working on releases for the Nintendo DS and Wii, while occasionally being involved with PS3 and 360 games. These 2 developers crossed paths around 2008, when Deep Silver Vienna announced its Vienna branch was working on a horror game called Cursed Mountain, in cooperation with other studios. One of those studios? Sproing Interactive. Their homegrown game engine, called Athena, was used as the basis for Cursed Mountain for 2 reasons: the Wii and the game's setting. Athena was designed to work with the Wii hardware for rendering what I'll call the elements, particularly ice, heat, water, and the various reflections and refractions they would naturally create. As for the setting, Cursed Mountain, as the name might imply, takes place way up in the mountains, specifically the Himalayas. Makes sense that a game about scaling a mountain was developed by a studio in Austria. You know, where the Alps are. As for the setting, the Athena engine was also advertised as having a streaming system that would allow for a very long draw distance and a fast particle system for generating effects like snowstorms, fog, smoke, soft shadows, and motion blur. So going back to my original question, who survived longer? The studio formed by ex-Rockstar Vienna directors with a major media conglomerate behind it? Or the smaller developer who largely flew under the radar and tended to develop middling titles that might be referred to by some as shovelware? Sproing Interactive had a decent run of about 15-ish years before filing for insolvency, which is fancy money speak for
I'm in debt up to my eyeballs.
Meanwhile, Deep Silver Vienna technically started operations in 2007, and they were shut down by Koch Media after their co-founders left in 2010, meaning Cursed Mountain is the only game they saw to the finish line. I have to phrase it that way because they were working on another game before getting shuttered. Ride to Hell Retribution. Although that might have been the more open-world sandbox version of Ride to Hell. You know, in that narrow window of opportunity when that game had a chance in hell of being good. Geese, what did you think about that?
Predictable!
Yeah, I thought so. In terms of release window, there actually wasn't a whole lot going on when Cursed Mountain came out in August of 2009. Yes, there were games like Batman Arkham Asylum and Wolfenstein on the PS3 and 360, but on the Wii specifically, within a month of the game's release were the likes of Madden, NBA 2K, Beatles Rock Band, and Monster Hunter Tri, which are far removed from the kind of game Cursed Mountain is. That said, the marketing for Cursed Mountain was virtually non-existent. That wasn't the case in Europe. I did find some Cursed Mountain ads and posters from European magazines, as well as a TV ad and a series of totally legit players getting scared by the game YouTube clips, which amassed a staggering couple hundred views each over the span of 14 years. But in the US, outside of a 2-minute trailer on YouTube, I found almost no examples of advertising for Cursed Mountain. Hell, I played this game around its launch date, and to this day, I still have no idea how I knew this game existed. No, really, see? I still have the new game price sticker on it. I'm less surprised that I somehow knew about this game and bought it new, and more depressed that $50 isn't the standard new game price. There was also a limited edition which included a making-of DVD and a soundtrack disc. But good luck finding a complete version of it for a decent price now. Actually, wait a second, let's go back to that one poster I showed earlier. Look at the text in the corner. The first survival horror game exclusively for the Wii. Is that true?
No.
1 month before Cursed Mountain came out, Ju-On the Grudge was released in Japan, which is technically survival horror. But that's just Japan, right? Surely there wasn't another survival horror game exclusively for the Wii that had been out for years and would make this ad a complete lie. Oh hi Necronesia, aka Escape from Bug Island, a survival horror game that released so early in the Wii's life cycle that it was a launch title in Japan. Yeah, the bar for survival horror exclusives on the Wii at this point was set pretty low. And even the exclusively for the Wii part doesn't apply, because in Europe, this game was ported to PCs about 6 months later. So they managed to cram 2 lies into less than 10 words, which may even surpass Bethesda in terms of words per lie. But it's not as though no one was talking about this game. There were several interviews about Cursed Mountain involving Martin Phillip, the guy behind Deep Silver Vienna's developer relations. Outside of that, appearances and interviews were done by Chad McNeil, who this game credits as... Actually, wait, he's not in the credits at all. Who is this guy? Chad was the marketing manager for Deep Silver, and even though he seems to know what the game is like, he has a weird way of describing what's scary about it.
We want to be able to have people remember themselves when they were a kid and they went into their parents' basement and it was completely and totally dark, and you wanted your brother or sister with you. Because if you didn't have them with you, you were terrible.
I think he's trying to talk about the environment being scary, but it just sounds like he's projecting his own fear of dark basements. Besides, even when I was really young, my parents' basement wasn't that bad. It was just a little dark. It was the attic where there were snakes with skeleton hands for heads that would drag me back to their nest and do horrible things to me if I didn't get at least a B in all of my classes. Or at least that's what my brother told me. Speaking of brothers, the game starts with some narration from Eric Simmons. He and his brother Frank are both skilled mountain climbers from the UK. The instruction booklet says they're British, but they specifically sound Scottish.
I have to find something Frank used and bring it back. Sounds like crap to me, but I don't have much choice.
Yes, that is why I'm wearing this shirt. But Frank went missing while climbing a mountain called Chomolonzo. They were sent by another big-time climber named Edward Bennett to recover some mysterious artifact from near the mountain's peak. After finding it, they got into a heated argument, Paul returned to base camp, and Frank kept climbing higher alone. Yes, Frank kept climbing after finding what he was hired to find and bring back. Plot hole, Frank being a moron... It's actually both, but we'll get to that later. A storm cuts off Frank from anyone that could potentially help him, and his climb doesn't exactly end well. Since Eric is nearby and already acclimatized, Bennett calls him to rescue Frank, which is apparently something Eric has had to do before.
Once again, it's Eric Simmons off to rescue his kid brother. If I find that stupid bastard alive, I'm gonna kill him.
And at this point, you might be asking the same question that I, or someone who's not into mountain climbing or geography would. Is Chomolonzo a real mountain?
Yes!
Despite what the game's design director says about the game's mountain being made up,
Even though Cursed Mountain takes place on a fictional mountain,
Chomolonzo is in the same area as two other huge mountains, Everest and Lhotse. We haven't started playing yet, and they're already being inconsistent about this. It has 3 different peaks, which, when seen from the east, make it look like a giant eagle. Now smartass as in the giant bird. That's how the mountain got its name. Chomolonzo roughly translates to bird goddess, which will become very relevant later on. Anyway, Eric bribes a truck driver to take him to a city called Lando and meet up with Bennett. But he finds that the city is deserted, and even the truck driver refuses to actually enter the city. Eric quickly discovers an ice axe which belongs to Frank and... Wait, how did Frank's ice axe make it all the way down the mountain to this random-ass building on a random-ass corpse? He clearly still had it in the cutscene. It's revealed later through a diary entry that this axe was prepared by Bennett and supposed to be given to Frank at base camp, but ghostly figures prevented this person from giving it to him. So technically it's not Frank's axe, and either Bennett was extremely late/forgetful about Frank having this before the climb, because we'll learn later that he knew about what could happen or was happening, or this was added by the developers later as a haphazard way to explain how an item marked as Frank's axe wound up here. This is the main weapon in the game, but early on it's just there to break open the many identical huge vases spread throughout the mountain, roughly 80 to 85% of which have nothing in them. We're barely into this game, but I already have some criticisms, one of which is the character animations, some of which are just janky or non-existent. Several of them aren't looped properly or have weird hitches or collision errors, like when Eric goes up and down ladders, or how when he's moving while on a staircase or too close to elevated or lowered surfaces, he'll just shoot upward or drop down in a single frame. As the game goes on and inclined ground becomes more common, this becomes progressively worse. Hell, it also happens to the ghosts, but at least they have the excuse of being incorporeal. It even does that bootleg cutscene thing where there's a view change and all the models need a couple frames to snap into position. There's also the way Eric moves. I'm not bothered by Eric's running speed, or should I say jogging speed, because he usually has climbing gear on and is trudging up rugged snow or rock or ice-covered terrain, so that at least makes sense. What did bug me is that if I wasn't holding the control stick perfectly straight to either side, Eric would walk forward or backward while turning quickly, which was a pain in the ass for navigating tight spaces. Fortunately, this game doesn't allow Eric to walk off the sides of cliffs, but it does allow him to walk off short ledges instead of having to backtrack to a staircase, which I appreciated. After some wandering around, Eric starts seeing ghosts wandering the streets, and the game gives a warning about not alerting ghosts to the sound of him jogging. I mostly ignored this warning. Did the game punish me for it?
No.
The ghost encounters in this game are all at set times and locations, so this warning seems to be in place so you don't accidentally move too far ahead during non-cutscene choreographed spooks, which is something I did almost immediately. Anyway, it's not long before a ghost tries to attack, with dance moves that Christopher Walken would be proud of. But a monk steps in and wards the ghost off before explaining how Eric can open his third eye to ward off spirits and purify shrines. Eric, a non-Buddhist pasty Scotsman, learns how to do this in about 4 seconds. And the monk who needed years upon years of training to be able to do that is probably wishing for Eric's head to explode. He then performs the game's first 2 motion controls to purify the shrine. For the record, the third is shaking off a ghost that grabs Eric. You know, this area that effectively functions as a tutorial level doesn't introduce that many mechanics, but it does drag unless you completely avoid looking for items and documents. And if it seems like I'm avoiding talking too much about how the game plays, that's because the meat of the game doesn't appear until Eric actually starts climbing the mountain. So sorry to those of you thinking,
when are they gonna get to
Chomolonzo. Upon meeting up with Bennett, a climber who lost his leg after accidentally finding a new direction it could bend, he says he can perform a ritual to see if Frank is still alive, but he needs some personal item Frank made contact with. Eric, not believing any of this but having little choice, tracks down a bell that A, is supposedly a meaningful item to Frank but doesn't seem like it from the cutscenes, B, Eric somehow recognizes as specifically belonging to Frank, and C, is conveniently a couple of rooms and one staircase away from where Bennett was standing. Anyway, after Bennett is not shown performing the ritual and Eric doesn't know if Frank is still alive, which isn't a given because 3 days have passed since they lost contact with him, Eric just starts climbing the mountain anyway. Granted, Eric is skeptical of the ritual and that the ghosts he's seen so far are just a product of high-altitude sickness, even though he said he was acclimatized at the beginning of the game and would thus not be subject to high-altitude sickness. Good news, everyone, we're on the mountain now, so I'm not worried about getting ahead of myself anymore. And now I can finally start answering the number one question anyone asks with horror games. Is it scary? Well, let's start with the environment. Since almost all of the game takes place either up in the mountains, in mountain villages, or in mountain monasteries, two elements are constantly at work. One, the draw distance. From damn near every point in the game, it's possible to see not just the mountains rising around Eric, but also the places he's trying to reach, and the places he climbed up from, which does help make the world feel more complete and overwhelming, particularly when using the over-the-shoulder look function. Just don't look too far straight up or it might look like the simulation is falling apart. 2, the color palette, and I apologize, but I had to crank up the brightness for this game so that it wouldn't just be a bunch of shadows. It shouldn't be surprising that a game up in the mountains consists of a whole lot of white, gray, brown, and black. Even when inside various buildings, most of them are American cheese levels of bland in terms of color. The color in this game largely comes from things like the prayer flags that are strung all over the place, or some buildings that use fire and lighting and have colored tapestries on the wall. It seemed at first like this game associated color with comfort and safety, as the healing shrines are also a prominent red, and when close to ghosts, which are gray or in third eye mode, the game practically turns black and white. I say seemed like because it frequently undermines this, and the color-based theme gets muddled or lost entirely. Those prayer flags that are everywhere, it doesn't matter how many of them are around, ghost attacks will still happen. All ghost attacks are scripted to certain locations or picking up certain items, and they cause what look like inverted gray waterfalls to block off any potential escape. Yes, I am doing another video on a survival horror game where you cannot run away from the enemies. Also, I had to look up what those flags were and what they meant. Because of where Cursed Mountain takes place, there's a massive influence from Buddhism, and various references to significant Buddhist names, locations, objects, and concepts are all over the place. And I didn't know any of them. The first part of the making of DVD dedicates a solid 2 minutes to just talking about Buddhism's influence on the game.
Buddhism was founded about 1500 years ago by Siddhartha Gautama. He left his students information about the religion and daily routines in life cycles, which means every soul has to do as many life cycles as wisdom that was written down every 150 to 200 magically his terms are actually found information about the exact...
God, slow down. Wait. Sorry, is this going to be on the exam? Should I be writing all of this down? And beyond that, I struggle to keep most of the terms thrown at me straight. I'm quite familiar with the fear of the unknown concept in horror, but this is less unknown and more unfamiliar, so I wasn't scared by any of it so much as just confused. As for the mountain itself, the developers talked up how it was the greatest enemy in the game, throwing high winds and freezing temperatures and a lack of oxygen and treacherous climbs at Eric. I was completely on board with this philosophy, but did the game make good use of it?
No.
Just when you thought I was done using that clip, I show you how uncreative I really am.
The overwhelming majority of the game is spent battling ghosts on the mountain and not dealing with the mountain's obstacles. It's not until the last quarter of the game or so when most of what the developers talked about in the interviews happens consistently. Outside of that, there's just the occasional instance of climbing a wall, walking across a plank, or shimmying along a ledge. And for most of this and several wall climbs, it's not possible to fall. Beyond that, invisible walls ensure Eric won't fall off the side of a mountain or off any steep drop. So even though the setting is outside on a treacherous to climb mountain, the bulk of the game plays like he's at ground level running between a bunch of fences. So no, the environment, despite some decent qualities, isn't that scary, and the mountain itself isn't scary either. I will say though that the sound design has a good amount of effort put into it. There's a lot of crossover between environmental sounds, musical instruments from the region, and the occasional ghostly voice. Although when the voices start trying to say something, it's not as effective. That and when the audio skips. There's also a portion where Eric finds a walkie-talkie and gets instructions on where to go through the Wii Remote speaker, which is cool for immersion, but a pain in the ass for recording this video.
I'm going to fuck you out of there. Just listen to my voice, and everything will be okay.
The camera work also tries to build some kind of atmosphere. The bulk of the game uses an over-the-shoulder view, but it also cuts to fixed or follow cams in certain areas, at which point the controls become like Fatal Frame, entirely third person, and if you just keep holding forward during the transition, you can keep moving wherever you were aiming before instead of immediately veering into a wall. So they did a decent job on that front. Although speaking of transitions... This happens a lot. Cursed Mountain does have regular cutscenes that play at certain times, and even back then this game was criticized for basically using dressed-up storyboard images and throwing a half dozen visual effects at them. But it also just...
You're beautiful.
tosses them in seemingly random spots and then immediately cuts back to the game like a desperate jump scare. Awkward, to say the least. The only thing I could think of that would be more awkward than this is if this game about a British climber going missing while trying to climb solo up a mountain in the Himalayas was conceptualized and started development within a year of a real-life British climber going missing while trying to climb solo up a mountain in the Himalayas and dying in controversial fashion.
Of the 11 deaths during this climbing season, the most famous is David Sharp. As many as 40 climbers walked past David Sharp as he lay dying. Those who did see him assumed that he was resting or already dead, but David Sharp didn't die that night. The media reacted swiftly to the news that David Sharp was left to die.
The reason David Sharp could not be rescued was because it was physically impossible to do so.
We're doing this whether you like it or not.
Getting back to the original question, no, the mountain itself and the way it's presented also aren't scary. But I've overlooked something major. Enemies and combat. The main enemies in Cursed Mountain, and the ones I saw 95% of the time, are the spirits of people who died on the mountain. These could be climbers or villagers or people from the monasteries found along the way. Among all of them, there are 4 types of ghosts. The walking ghosts that move at a couple different speeds, but all of them want to crump with you, sweetie pie. The ones that fly around and either dive bomb you or stay back and cast
Lightning bolt! Lightning bolt!
The climber ghosts that do the Casper slide until they're close enough to attack, and the other climber ghosts that do the Casper slide and toss a Wonder Woman lasso at you. So if you want to get technical, it's maybe 3.5 different enemies. Given the length of this game, under 10 hours for me while exploring and trying to find absolutely everything, there simply isn't enough enemy variety through the whole game to not get bored of fighting the same spirit for the 48th or 49th time, let alone the 50th. And it's not just regular enemies where this is a problem. There are 6 boss battles spread across Cursed Mountain, and 3 of them involve the same creature.
Then again, there are people watching me do the same old shit in these videos for over a decade, so who am I to judge?
Enemies can be dealt with by either swinging the axe at them, and no, that's not a motion control, it's just a button press, in a janky-looking 3-hit combo, although the knockback means 2 of those hits will miss unless you pin them against an invisible wall, or by going into third eye mode and using the axe to shoot them with energy blasts. That's not an editing mistake, I left that pause in so all of us could let that sink in. You can either keep dealing damage until the ghost disappears, or do a certain amount of damage to cause a symbol to appear on them. By aiming at it in third eye mode and inputting a few motion controls, a ritual is performed which dispels the ghost, and you regain a bit of health for it. These motions are supposed to mimic the mudras, or gestures, of prayer rituals, which is something I thought was a cool idea until I actually tried visualizing this.
Guys, sorry, God, I'm sorry to interrupt the prayer, but I gotta change the batteries. One sec.
The axe is the only weapon in the game, but with a few attachments and decorations found throughout, it has 3 extra modes of fire. A more powerful shot with a slower rate of fire, a spread shot, and a tether that, with a flick of the remote, can induce the ritual to get rid of the ghost immediately, albeit without the health bonus at the end. Now that you know how combat in this game works, I have a question for you. Why would you ever use melee attacks instead of just shooting everything?
I mean...
I am mountain.
Sure, the game tries to mix things up by tossing multiple ghosts at you at once, having ghosts attack in a tightly enclosed space, and even trapping Eric in a space where his health slowly drains until he either gets rid of all the ghosts, or removes whatever seal or spell is responsible for this. There are even a couple of points where the ghosts can't be damaged without burning incense to make them visible and or vulnerable. But the damage between the axe and the individual shots is pretty comparable, and the hitboxes for melee attacks are nebulous at best. They're somehow really huge, but also hard to hit consistently. Even so, I made it a point to use melee attacks for most of the game and still had very few times where I was struggling to get by. This, combined with having to fight pretty much everything you see, means that the ghosts and the fights with them also aren't scary. But is the prospect of dying scary? Well, in addition to being able to regain some health from enemies with the ritual, one of the only items in the game that doesn't function as a key or document is incense sticks. These can be burned at those little red shrines to regain a fair amount of health. But by the time I was in the last stage or 2 of the game, I still had 18 of them with me. The stronger / more difficult to fight ghosts give back more health for each ritual performed to dispel them. So when you learn how to exploit the weird hitboxes, effectively spam ranged attacks, or both, there's often little or no tension, with one exception I'll get to later. There's also the fact that if Eric survives an encounter with low health, the game will just give some of it back to him, restoring him to roughly half of the base health bar like he just sent in some survival horror mail-in rebate. Having a somewhat hidden recurring statue that extends the life bar when interacted with doesn't help this either. Nor does a recurring hidden item, the Wrath of Ekajati statue, which... Actually, I'm not sure what it does. The game doesn't know what it does, the instruction book doesn't say what it does, the guy who wrote the GameFAQs article for this doesn't know what it does. It supposedly increases the damage of the axe swings, but only the follow-up swings, and not the initial one for some reason? So many parts of this game feel so disjointed, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that don't quite fit together. And there might be a good reason for that. According to a Gamescom 2009 conference, there were 16 companies spread across 14 countries involved in Cursed Mountain's development. That's a lot for an average-length linear horror game. How did all of these companies stay in touch? Simple. Skype video calls. That's a very mid to late 2000s solution, handling your game dev with the same program that my friends and I would use to watch old cartoons and voice chat during multiplayer games. This is likely why the people who did interviews for this game were a Deep Silver marketing guy and the head of developer relations. There were so many studios working on so many parts of this game that an interview with one of them would yield the answer, "I don't know, we didn't work on that," over and over and over. Story-wise, the writer had to hash out what was happening in areas he either hadn't seen yet or didn't understand the purpose of. Which is why, even though I'm going to be pretty hard on some story elements later, I don't entirely blame the writer for this. Some suppliers went out of business during Cursed Mountain's development. And of course, some team members didn't understand their roles and took on responsibilities they weren't supposed to. I'd say this game's development was one giant game of telephone, but given what I mentioned earlier, it's more like one giant laggy Skype call where everyone has a crappy headset mic that picks up their breathing and accidentally rubbing the cord more than anything they say. And speaking of poor communication, that's part of how everything went to hell on the mountain. It's apparent very early on that climbing Chomolonzo involves performing certain rituals first, such as circumambulation, or doing a lap around the mountain. In this case, 12 laps, followed by tantric rituals, none of which Frank completed. It's also apparent from the documents found that Frank is an unlikable scumfuck who is drunk on the smell of his own shit. Eric must be a goddamn saint, because how the fuck do you put up with this guy, let alone rescue him? What's not apparent is even if you collect all the documents in the game, it'll still say you're missing 2 of them. That's because 2 of the documents were converted into cutscenes and nobody bothered to fix the counter. So about that communication issue I mentioned earlier. Almost there. Eric is given a lead very early on to get in touch with a lady named Jomo Menmo, a powerful and mystical yogini who lives nearby. Upon meeting her, she asks for something bonded to Frank, and Eric apparently carried that bell all the way up here? How did he know he would need that? She has an apprentice named Mingma Yangzi who tried performing rituals with Frank to safely climb the mountain. And based on the flashes of scenes with both of them, the rituals are rather intimate. And I might as well address this now. The voices can be a bit hit and miss, but they did mostly cast people with pretty extensive acting pedigrees to work on this game. See if you can tell what else, what other very recent Game of the Year candidate you might have heard this actress in.
Flesh is truth, bones tell truth. Give flesh to gods, so bones can speak.
Wham! Zap!
Thank goodness Blum took the hammer away from him. It's not Thor's hammer, no matter what he keeps saying.
Oh yeah, and she was also in all of these games. Meanwhile, the lead, Eric Simmons, is voiced by George Anton, and this dude is also legit, appearing in plays, TV shows, and movies for decades alongside the likes of Harrison Ford and John Slattery. Hell, here's a scene of him working directly with Liam Neeson.
Oliansky, Captain, bring the planes to full rise. Keep 10 up. Make turns for 20 knots. Full ahead together.
Planes to full rise. Full ahead together. Keep 10 up.
In this game, he gets the chance to talk not just during cutscenes, but in-game when hitting certain locations to give some insight into what he's thinking.
It's awe-inspiring. Built right into the living rock. It's been too long. Frank can't possibly be alive. What the hell am I doing?
But George's performance is also undermined a bit by the insistence on using filters for his voice half the time. I get that he's speaking into the tape recorder he's carrying around, but this can cause his words to blend in with the background noise and otherwise become difficult to understand. And it also just sounds like he's talking into an empty Pringles can.
Only Jomo Menmo can appease goddess. Baldelamos Ras. She says follow, but don't trust senses.
Just for the record, no, this game did not affect his career. Right after Cursed Mountain, he made a few appearances in The Tudors and Law & Order UK. If you need something more recent and video game related, how about Alien Isolation?
Why? Because he was going to kill me. You saved my life. This is about survival.
Speaking of isolation, Jomo Menmo lures Eric out to a ritual site. When she speaks with the mountain goddess, she immediately turns on Eric and shoves him off a cliff after hearing what Frank did with Mingma.
Brother steal Mingma. Rape goddess mother. Your blood to pay.
This is the part where we say fuck Frank and go home, right? Assuming Eric's still alive?
Well, yes, he is. Otherwise the game would be really short. After trying to find a way back up, Eric stumbles upon the first, second, and fourth boss in the game. A vulture... ghost... thing. Screw it, I'm officially dubbing him... Damage bird, bird recharges, break seals on statues so bird can't recharge, win. Even with my insistence on using melee against the bird the whole time and being chased by ghosts in the latter half of the fight, I took no damage on the first try. It doesn't matter though, because 10 minutes later, comes back, picks up Eric, and drops him somewhere else. This is twice now Eric has fallen at least a few dozen feet and been perfectly fine afterward. Somewhere else in this case is Jomo Menmo's tent again. When follows Eric to them, Jomo Menmo scolds him for leading it to her and sends him back out to fight it and hopefully die. The fight doesn't involve anything but damaging the bird and doing the ritual motions to it at the end, so it's more underwhelming than the first time. But it does end with the bird getting impaled on a stake.
Can ghosts be impaled? Or is it not a spirit now, or... I'll admit, part of me was hoping the bird was faking it. And then when Eric got too close, it would just phase through the stake, grab him, fly off, and drop him off another cliff, and then point and laugh at him while saying, "You stupid Westerner," in bird speak. With the bird thing apparently dead, Jomo Menmo does another ritual and finds that the goddess of the mountain is undecided as to Frank's fate. I'll help you out with that one, mountain goddess. Kill him. Don't hesitate, just kill him. After almost being ritualistically sacrificed at a small village, which he avoids by moving a few inches to his left, Eric reaches a monastery. Easily one of the more visually interesting areas, if only because almost everything before this was mostly shades of gray, white, and brown. It's around this time that Eric starts seeing and hearing visions of Frank. Or the ghosts are screwing with him, it's not entirely clear. He's saved from one aggressive ghost by a monk who reveals that he's the one who discovered a scroll which had been written over twice, with the initial writing being the location of a terma on the mountain, with termas being ancient Buddhist wisdom written down and hidden by magic until it's needed again. Hidden by the magic of an ancient monk who saw a scroll with the location written on it, erased it, and used it to write a diary entry, apparently.
The monk gave the scroll to his master to study, but he also told Bennett what he found, and Bennett went off alone before they figured out where it was. It didn't end well. When he got his peg leg installed and the prophecy was deciphered from the scroll, Bennett believed Frank was the guy who would find the terma somewhere high up Chomolonzo. Which sounds like Bennett just went, "Oh yeah, I totally know who the prophecy's talking about. It's this guy I can lure up the mountain with money and ego stroking." There are rituals for going up the mountain, which Frank didn't do, but he was doing another ritual with Mingma, which also went to shit, and the mountain goddess, now doubly pissed, unleashed hell.
Just based on what I've seen to this point, I think I understand the moral of the story here. And frankly, it's a tale as old as time. White people ruin everything.
Eric is skeptical of all of this, even though he spent the past few hours fighting ghosts and a bird demon. But the monk tells him to seek out the spirits of the dead llamas, who mean him no harm, and use his tape recorder to record their mantras. They mean him no harm, But the hill covered with spikes that Eric can't see outside of third eye mode? That does mean him harm. And if he touches any of them, the spirits disappear and he has to start the hill climb over. Something about their perspective made this really awkward to do, and it became pretty frustrating pretty quickly. After that, he doesn't use the mantras, or it's unclear how they're used. Instead, the monk has him sit at an altar in the shrine and meditate to lure out the ghost of the shrine keeper and defeat him. I wouldn't mention this at all, but there's a motion required for this, and it's only loosely implied that you need to perform the motion at a certain speed in order for it to work. Eric is told that Frank's spirit is in the bardo, and to greatly oversimplify what that is, think of it as limbo. He's not alive, but he's not dead. Eric receives a scroll on how to bring Frank back from the bardo, which he still doesn't believe is real, and is sent to another monastery to find its abbot, Kingpo Jingmei Lingma, to discuss finding his brother. But when he gets to the monastery,
I've got a climber dead on the mountain and no treasure to show for it.
The value of the Terma lies only in the wisdom it reveals.
Bollocks, you old fraud! We both know the possessor of the Terma will become immortal.
I know you're out there, Simmons. You want to fight ghosts while your brother freezes?
Fine. But I'm going back to base camp while there's still time.
Dude, the game won't let him progress if he doesn't fight the ghosts. I mean, he doesn't have magical plot device teleporting. Wait, immortality? With the revelation that Bennett apparently isn't being hounded by ghosts and he thinks the Terma is an infinite life cheat code, Lingpa has Eric sit with him and teaches him how to enter the bardo and find out if Frank is still alive. And again, this random Scotsman is able to figure this shit out really, really fast. Who knew the Wii Remote and Nunchuck were such great tools for teaching Buddhism? What follows is a long explanation about the levels of bardo and peaceful entities and wrathful... Alright. I can't watch this anymore. It's so scary, my sides hurt. Frank somehow entered the bardo while still alive, which basically means his spirit's in limbo, but his body is still in the real world. Eric then enters the bardo himself, and after fighting through a ghostly village, he seems to find... himself. Nah, it's a six-armed demon that wants to wear Frank like a loincloth. Great camera work, guys. Credit where it's due, this is a mostly interesting boss fight. You have to lure it into destroying the barrier it put up to trap Eric, then take potshots at it until it's stunned to perform a healing ritual on the mark on its back. And in the final phase, it jumps around awkwardly and is a total sitting duck. Okay, never mind, it was interesting for 2 of the 3 phases. After finishing the Bardo's Tale... Wait, does anyone get that except me? Eric realizes Frank is still alive. And this revelation is so shocking the game locked up on the loading screen for the next stage, and I had to do the boss fight all over again. And no, I checked, there were no scratches or marks on the disc.
God!
It's at this point when Eric suddenly puts on more climbing gear. He also starts seeing the ghost of Mingma, who leads him over mountain ridges and to another area with invisible third eye spikes you won't know are there until you walk over them. The annoyingly long path through those spikes leads to Mingma's corpse. Eric learns that her ritual with Frank, which was supposed to help appease the goddess after he didn't do the 12 laps around the mountain, was invalidated by her romance with another man, Paul Ward, Frank's climbing partner. If you forgot he existed and that twist fell flat because of it, that's okay, I forgot too. Enraged by this, Bennett stormed after Mingma and stabbed her to death. But isn't Mingma's corpse in a very different location than where the ritual took place? And Bennett still just has one leg at this point, and he was still able to chase her down, and they don't have any cold weather gear or climbing equipment, and so either Mingma was thrown as far down the mountain as she was away from it, Or these two found some Mario 64 cannons and had a really awesome off-screen chase scene. Oh look, the wind and cold temperatures are finally a factor. It only took playing through 2/3 of the game for that to happen. Oh god damn it, this guy again? After being picked up and dropped by... again... I swear, Eric is becoming Wile E. Coyote with how many long falls he survived. He stumbles upon the first of many destroyed climber camps, and a not-so-happy climber's ghost. Those of you who saw/knew this is a Wii game are probably wondering at this point, why haven't I talked more about the controls, particularly anything motion-related? Well, that's partially because, for a Wii game, there frankly aren't that many, and no, that's not a Frank pun. But it's also because I wanted to wait until this point to show you where and why those controls do and don't work. A fair share of the game runs relatively smoothly, but when it's time to add in weather effects and multiple enemies to go with the long draw distances and the occasional visual effects of Third Eye mode, the game does slow down or drop frames. This drop in visual quality trickles down and affects the controls. Aside from basic movement becoming a bit more difficult, Cursed Mountain uses motion controls for certain inputs, climbing faster, pushing ghosts away, and those aren't impacted much. The motions for the ritual to get rid of ghosts and regain a bit of health, though, oh, they can become a big pain in the ass. Taking too long to perform any of the ritual gestures causes it to fail and the ghost to need to be hit again so you can try the ritual again. The Wii Remote and Nunchuck have two motions each, a diagonal swing and a forward thrust. The swing I had no issues with, but the forward thrusts, even after seeing the on-screen prompt for how to do them, were far from consistent. And that's after I removed the Wii Motion Plus, because that came out after Cursed Mountain and the game wasn't designed with it in mind. Whenever the game slowed down or dropped frames and I had to input these motions, they became way less responsive, and the forward thrust turned into me thrusting so hard I almost conceived a third child. Calm down, it's just a joke, I don't have any kids, and if I did, I sure as hell wouldn't let them near any of my video games. Fuck them kids. There is a way to get the inputs to read more consistently, but it goes against the natural reaction to inputs not reading. When I did the swipes or thrusts and they didn't register, my response was to swing the control harder and faster to have more chances at it working and avoid running out of time. This is the exact opposite of what works. When I was more deliberate with the gestures and paused a bit between each of them, the game recognized them more often. But even so, I'd still have moments where I was nearly closing the gap between where I was standing and the sensor bar to get the game to read my inputs. Anyway, this boss fight is almost identical to the first one, but afterward the bird guy just drops into a crevasse, then waits until Eric steps close to the edge to fly out and knock him in. When he comes to, Eric follows some caverns in the crevasse, survives a completely original and not overdone by this point QuickTime event, and finds a working walkie-talkie on a dead climber, one he uses to get in contact with Paul Ward. Paul's voice can be heard guiding Eric through the caverns with the speaker on the Wii Remote, which is good for immersion, but annoying for trying to capture what he's saying.
Don't sit when you're cold. Keep moving, no matter how painful.
But even with Paul's help... Quick question, now that we're in an enclosed space and the draw distance and rendering the entire outdoors aren't issues, why does the game's frame rate still dip regularly? Eric eventually emerges from the elevated depths to finally make it to base camp. Surprise, the base camp is also overrun by ghosts and dead bodies. Can you tell how shocked I was by this? Eric finds the place where the rituals with Mingma were performed, including a final, more sexually charged one. But when Mingma feels the blessings of the mountain goddess leave her, rendering the ritual useless...
Mountain. I leave today. We're doing this whether you like it or not.
Finish or not, no matter. You need another. No, don't go. Begin again. Goddess not forgive.
What a bloody waste of time.
No.
You whore.
How tall is this mountain again? Because whatever the answer to that question is, that's how many reasons we have to say fuck you, Frank, and leave. And Bennett, who likes to watch, somehow catches up to Migma on one leg, and you know the rest. Eric eventually finds a crashed helicopter and loots a crate for some high-altitude climbing equipment, which leads to finding Paul and Bennett arguing over who's to blame for the ritual failing.
I didn't seduce her. We fell in love. You can ask her.
Her amulet. You killed her.
Now, Eric, you have the same choice as him.
You might be a little confused as to why Bennett just transformed into what looks like concept art for a Magic the Gathering card, and I'll just let you know, so am I. First of all, when my response to a big twist like this is being thankful that the cutscene gave me enough time to stop laughing before the fight began, that's a bad sign. Second, while this might explain why Bennett was able to move around the mountain without being bothered by the ghosts, it doesn't explain why he's a demon, how or when he became a demon, why none of the monks could detect that he was a demon, or why he's after the Terma for eternal life when he's a goddamn demon. In the first phase, he jump teleports around and tries to take a swipe at Eric. In the next phase, he summons ghosts from the nearby corpses, but otherwise does the same thing. Then this guy actually does cast.
Lightning bolt! Lightning bolt!
By the way, listen to this fight for a moment. No music, barely any ambience, and a whole lot of wind. Paired with how easy the fight is, this moment in the story almost instantly loses whatever luster it had. One ritual later, the Bennett demon just disappears, and the game locked up on the loading screen again, forcing me to do the Bennett fight twice. Do you have any idea how many times I wondered if this game became sentient, knew I was making a video on it, and pulled shit like this on purpose? It's here, with only a couple areas left before the end, that the oxygen gauge comes into play. Eric has to keep finding oxygen tanks on the way to the peak, otherwise he'll run out and his health will drain as he slowly dies of hypoxia. This gauge starts off very low, so there is some tension in trying to stay alive. For about 7 or 8 minutes. Beyond that, my oxygen gauge never dipped low enough to be of any concern, and about 20 minutes into the level, I had a completely full oxygen tank and was starting to walk past other tanks in case I needed them later. Or just topping off for no good reason. Eric starts to see visions of Frank climbing ahead of him.
I give my life, not for honor, but for you.
And then he finds where the Terma was hidden. Sitting on a pedestal in a hollowed-out portion of the mountain, right next to the path to the summit. I'm going to assume this cave wasn't there before, because otherwise this wouldn't make sense.
Let's start down. The storm is getting worse.
No. I'm going to summit. Try to stop me, and you'll get hurt.
The goddess won't like this, Frank. She won't like this at all.
Why is Frank so hellbent on not just going to the summit, but taking the Terma with him? I know he said this mountain hadn't been climbed to the peak yet, and Frank even says himself that part of the reason he took Bennett's offer, aside from the truckload of money, was that Chomolonzo had never been summited, but there's just one tiny little problem with this, and it's something I've been holding back on saying since I explained what Chomolonzo is. Even considering that this game takes place in the 1980s, and even considering that Chomolonzo is only the 24th highest mountain in the world, higher than other mountains that Frank is said to have climbed solo, somebody already summited Chomolonzo 30 years earlier. And they did it as an afterthought on their way to climbing a taller mountain. Frank is a climber who previously reached the top of Mount Everest by himself. Either there's no logical reason for him to be so obsessed with reaching the peak of a mountain that's much shorter, or he's climbing the northeast face, which is roughly 3,000 meters high and at an incredibly steep incline, though the game makes it look like he wasn't doing that. Or Frank is just so stupid that not only did he not check if this mountain was climbed before, but being starved of oxygen for several hours doesn't affect his already terrible decision-making. How did this guy not get himself killed much sooner?
Also, Eric's about to finish climbing the same mountain by himself using whatever equipment he could find along the way, and being attacked by every ghost from Night on Bald Mountain. So I'll say it again. Fuck Frank.
After a more than 10-minute long fight against so many ghosts that the game turned into a shoot-'em-up, Eric suddenly doesn't need oxygen anymore for some reason, and gets some occasional disembodied monologuing from Frank.
You were like a god to me. You could do no wrong. I hated your guts. No punishment I ever got was greater than the look of disappointment in your eyes. I never beat you. Not once. Was it so important to you to always win? Did you never once think of making it easy for me?
You're not going to make Frank likable or relatable in any way, game. That ship has not only sailed, but smashed into an iceberg and sunk to the bottom of the sea. Eric discovers Frank's bag, and inside are two things: the Terma and a photo of him and Eric. Frank somehow completely changed his clothes and opened the Terma, figuring he was going to die anyway, and wandered into the Bardo. But apparently put the Terma back into the bag somehow before going into the Bardo. When Eric finally reaches the summit, he finds Frank's body, but...
Frank?
He is not here.
Where the hell are you?
I am here. I am the mountain. Everyone must fight their demons, Eric. Even those who believe they have none.
And the mountain... demon attacks? It's not the goddess, but I'm not sure what exactly it's supposed to be. Unless it is the goddess and they just didn't convey it that well, I don't know. This boss actually starts off on a good note, by which I mean they bothered to put in background music for it. And I kinda like it. It will charge and generate high winds to try blowing Eric off the mountain in the first phase, but then...
You think of Buddhism as a religion of peace. Did you never wonder why all our monks learned to fight?
Because they're prepping for a tournament to prevent Shao Kahn and the Outworld from taking over Earthrealm?
In Phase 2, the demon casts...
Lightning bolt! Lightning bolt!
And Eric continually takes damage. I hate that this boss uses the same lightning attack as Bennett, but not as much as I hated realizing that by keeping my distance and shooting at it, I was doing the fight entirely wrong. You're supposed to get up close and bait the demon into getting its claw stuck in the ground, at which point a few seals appear on its back. Get them all, shoot it a few more times, and it's over. A decent start to the fight, but a bit underwhelming in the end. Eric uses the Terma to awaken Frank and lift the curse. But Frank...
I'm not going.
Don't be an idiot. You're sick. We're both sick. It's the altitude.
Why do we climb mountains? Is it to get away from ourselves? Or to find our true self? My true self isn't pretty, big brother. I've learnt what I can from this life. It's time to move on and try again.
I'm bloody well not leaving you here!
Eric Simmons to the rescue. Isn't that what you used to say? Well, you can lay that down now. You've done well. Mum and Dad would be proud. Goodbye, Eric.
Alright, I might feel a little bad for Eric, but as I've said before, fuck Frank, and fuck this 11th hour attempt at a redemption arc. Eric leaves the Terma with Frank's body, which somehow isn't covered in snow and ice after being up there for several days, and the game just ends. Eric still doesn't quite believe anything he saw, the Terma is still there for when someone else inevitably reaches the peak, and there are no answers for what happens with the villages and monasteries that were abandoned or full of dead bodies. Look, all I know is Jomo Menmo needs to call dibs on Bennett's home. Either she moves in and it's a huge upgrade from the tent that she had, or she lets it appreciate in value and sells it to the next dumbass Westerner with a mountain fetish. Saying Cursed Mountain isn't the worst survival horror game I've played might be giving it too much credit. It feels like a game where the developers copied the homework of other survival horror games. It has ghosts, curses, and pseudo-religious overtones to go with an against-all-odds task. It checks the boxes of a horror game, but most of what it has is done in such a standardized, soulless, paint-by-numbers way that it can get tiring after the first couple hours. Even with the minimized motion controls, the ritual motions, due in part to the game's inability to run smoothly in several spots, become enough of a problem to turn the game into a chore at points. And of course, the brotherly love angle between Eric and Frank is so poorly paced and developed that I, a person with a brother in real life, felt virtually nothing when it was over. If you want a good story involving brothers, play Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons instead. But wait, is there anything worth going back to in this game? New Game Plus, unlockables, cheat codes, anything?
No.
The game has one story that follows one path for one difficulty setting with nothing unlockable and no cheats. The only way to stretch the runtime for this game is to try collecting all the statues, health buffs, and documents. But it's not possible to 100% this game because of the document problem I mentioned before. This is the kind of stuff that happens when you have over a dozen studios making one game with questionable communication between all of them. The sad thing is, there were people who put a lot of effort into this, like the guy who did the sound design, or whoever designed the instruction book. If the game lived up to this billing, I would have thought much better of it. But aside from not being particularly scary, much like the climbers left behind on Chomolonzo, Cursed Mountain has been more or less forgotten and abandoned. And you know what? I think that's why I'm still making videos like these. I enjoy going back to these lesser known or less remembered games, even if they aren't particularly good, and seeing what I can learn from them, because there's usually something interesting behind them. Even if they can be kind of a pain in the ass to play and record like this one.
Editor's log. 221,700 frames. I remember when this was supposed to be a short video. Bitter irony. The script snowballed. And now I'm up to my eyes in video clips. Desperately trying to think of something to put in the credits, so it's not just a black screen and text. The smell of Pringles is becoming nauseating.
It's better than I remember. Anyway.
And my Scottish accent somehow got worse since the Legend of Mana video. Hopefully this video will be done before Patreon updates its terms and conditions again. That pun sounded better in my head. But at least I can still...
Please. No.
What?